Welcome to the Empathy Stories channel, where powerful and emotional tales come to life. Today's story is one that challenges our perceptions and reveals the depths of human resilience and empathy. Join us as we journey through a profound moment of change in the courtroom. A moment that reveals how standing up for what's right can create ripples of transformation. Sarah Collins's morning began like any other. The sun had barely risen over Atlanta's skyline when her alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m. Today, however, was different. Unlike the usual rush to the federal courthouse, where Sarah, as a federal prosecutor, commanded respect, today she would be in the municipal court to handle a personal matter, a disputed parking ticket. She wasn't expecting much, just a quick appearance to sort things out. She dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue blazer over a white blouse and black pants. Her hair, natural for the first time in years after years of straightening it, framed her face with pride. At 35, Sarah had come a long way. She had graduated at the top of her class from Howard Law School and landed a prestigious position at the U.S. Attorney's Office. As she finished getting ready, Sarah gathered her papers for the case, grabbed a banana, and sipped coffee from her travel mug. She would deal with this minor issue before heading into her real work. Traffic in downtown Atlanta was heavy, but Sarah had left herself plenty of time to get to court by 9 a.m. Her new Mercedes, one of her rewards after securing a major corruption conviction, waited in the parking garage, gleaming with pride. As she drove, she couldn't help but notice the stare she often received from people who saw a young black woman stepping out of such an expensive vehicle. She had grown accustomed to it, though. She was determined to succeed despite the assumptions people made about her. Around 8:15 a.m., her phone rang. It was her boss, the U.S. Attorney himself. The urgency in his voice immediately caught her attention. "Sarah, I apologize for the early call, but we got a situation. The defense just submitted a motion that could derail the Thompson trafficking case. I need your eyes on this immediately." Her heart rate quickened. The Thompson case was one of the biggest human trafficking cases in Georgia's history. "Of course, sir. What's the timeline?" Sarah asked, trying to stay calm. "The judge has given us until noon to respond. I'll send the documents to your email now. Can you review them and call me back?" Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, already calculating the time. She would need to pull over somewhere, review the motion, and call her boss back. But she had no choice. The stakes were too high. The case could affect dozens of lives. Finding a spot in a small coffee shop parking lot, Sarah set up her laptop and quickly connected to her phone's hotspot. She started reviewing the defense's motion, taking detailed notes as the clock ticked on. But when she looked at her watch, her heart sank. It was already 8:50 a.m. She had 10 minutes to get to the municipal court, and parking would take time. She rushed back into traffic, calling her boss to report her findings. With the call completed, Sarah's mind raced. She had never been late for court before. It went against everything she stood for. But there was nothing she could do now. The delay had served a larger purpose, but it still weighed on her. By the time Sarah pulled into the municipal court parking lot at 9:10 a.m., she was nearly out of time. As she rushed toward the courthouse, she felt a mixture of frustration and determination. Little did she know that her slightly tardy arrival would soon set off a chain of events that would expose deep-rooted biases within the very system she had devoted her career to serving. Judge William Barrett, sitting at the helm of the municipal court, was about to deliver a harsh lesson in discrimination, a lesson Sarah wasn't prepared to ignore. Sarah's hurried steps echoed in the empty courthouse hallway as she made her way toward Judge Barrett's courtroom. She could feel the weight of the moment, a sense of impending tension in the air. The old municipal court was an intimidating place, its faded walls and cold, institutionalized look reminding everyone that this was a space for rules and order. As Sarah entered the courtroom, she could feel all eyes on her. But there was no time to worry about the stairs. She was here to handle something small, a parking ticket dispute, but in that very moment, she had no idea that her simple presence would unravel something much larger. Judge Barrett, an older man with graying hair and a reputation for rigid rules, had already begun the session. He was known for running his courtroom with military precision, never tolerating any disruptions. At 9:15 a.m., Sarah walked in quietly, hoping to avoid causing any disturbance. She carried with her the evidence, photographs showing the contradictory parking signs that had led to her ticket. Her mind was still partially occupied with the Thompson case, but she couldn't help but be aware of the late arrival, knowing she'd made a less-than-perfect entrance. The moment Sarah entered the courtroom, Judge Barrett froze mid-sentence. His eyes narrowed, immediately focusing on her. The room fell silent, and she felt every pair of eyes turned toward her. Sarah's heart beat faster. She tried to remain composed, but she could already sense the hostility in the air. He stopped talking and focused solely on her. "You must be Sarah Collins," Judge Barrett said, his tone biting. "Scheduled for 9 a.m. I see you've decided to join us now. Do you think your time is more valuable than the court's time?" "Miss Collins." Sarah stood at the podium, her hands clasped in front of her. She met his gaze steadily, trying to maintain the professional calm she was known for. But inside, a storm was brewing. How had he already decided she was late? Why hadn't he even looked at her paperwork or credentials? Her posture remained unwavering, but his tone, dripping with disapproval, was unmistakably prejudiced. She took a deep breath and tried to speak. "Your Honor, I can explain." "Save it." Judge Barrett cut her off sharply. "I've heard every excuse in the book. Car trouble, traffic, personal emergencies. None of it matters here. You're late. And in this court, we don't tolerate disrespect for the law." His eyes never left her, and his voice grew louder as he made an example of her. In the gallery, a few people shifted uncomfortably. A white businessman had arrived late just moments earlier, yet the judge had hardly acknowledged him. Sarah could feel the growing tension, and she noticed the looks of sympathy from some of the other defendants, especially a young black man who had been quietly watching the exchange. But she didn't let it faze her. She had been in tough situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about a parking ticket. This was a test of her patience, her dignity, and the system she had vowed to serve. Judge Barrett lifted his gavel, ready to impose his punishment. "Perhaps a fine will help you remember the importance of punctuality," he announced. His tone was final, and the courtroom fell completely silent. Everyone was waiting for what he would do next. As Sarah stood there, she realized that this wasn't just a matter of being late. It was a matter of something much bigger, something much more entrenched. This was a test of the system's fairness. The tension in the room seemed unbearable. And just as Judge Barrett prepared to hand down the fine, Sarah made a quiet but deliberate decision. She wasn't just going to accept this. She wasn't just a late defendant in his courtroom. No, this moment was about to change everything. The events that would follow would expose the truth in a way that no one expected, especially not the judge himself. As Judge Barrett prepared to announce the fine, Sarah's hand moved deliberately to her briefcase, where she kept a small leather holder. The weight of the moment was not lost on her. She had come to this courthouse for a simple parking ticket, but in the process, she was about to challenge an entire system. Without any warning, she pulled out her federal prosecutor's credentials, the gold seal catching the light in the courtroom. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The air seemed to crackle with tension as every person in the room took a collective breath. Sarah stood tall at the podium, her voice steady as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor," she said calmly, but with undeniable authority, "I need to properly introduce myself for the record." She held up her credentials for everyone to see, making sure Judge Barrett could no longer ignore who she was. "I am Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Collins, currently serving in the Northern District of Georgia." The words hung in the air, each one a quiet but powerful statement. The judge's face, which had been flushed with authority only moments before, drained of color. His hand, which had been reaching for the next case file, froze in midair. He stared at Sarah, his face betraying a sudden and uncomfortable realization. It was as if the room had expanded, and for the first time, Judge Barrett saw Sarah for what she truly was, not just a late defendant, but a federal prosecutor, someone with the power to change the entire course of this situation. "I apologize for my tardiness this morning," Sarah continued, her voice still firm, but now carrying the weight of her position. I was delayed due to an urgent federal case requiring immediate attention. The Thompson human trafficking prosecution. I'm sure Your Honor is familiar with it from the news. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in. I have written confirmation from the U.S. Attorney's Office, which I'm happy to provide to the court. The room remained silent as Judge Barrett's mind raced. The power dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically, and it was clear he had misjudged Sarah. His previous assumption that he could simply lecture her had been shattered in an instant. The young white woman who had been sitting quietly during the proceedings, who had also arrived late, sank lower in her seat. She, too, was a participant in this very system, but now she watched with growing unease as Sarah, a black woman, stood with authority in front of a judge who had never before faced such a challenge. I had no idea, Judge Barrett stammered, his voice faltering. His usual command had completely evaporated. He fumbled with the papers on his desk, trying to regain his composure. Attorney Collins, you should not have needed to know my position. Your Honor, Sarah interjected, her voice sharp but respectful. What matters here is the equal application of justice. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and the judge's discomfort was becoming evident to everyone in the room. Sarah continued, now addressing not only Judge Barrett, but the entire courtroom. I've documented several concerning patterns this morning, including the disparate treatment of defendants based on race and perceived status. Her words rang out with purpose. Judge Barrett, your actions today serve as an example of systemic bias, and I, for one, will not let that go unchecked. A quiet murmur passed through the gallery, a ripple of realization running through the crowd. James Wilson, the elderly black man who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, gave Sarah a small, approving nod. He had seen this kind of injustice many times before, but had never witnessed anyone stand up to it quite like this. Judge Barrett, sensing his authority slipping, immediately attempted to backtrack. I'm sure we can discuss this in chambers, he said quickly, his voice now laced with unease. And, of course, the fine is dismissed. We can forget this misunderstanding. But Sarah didn't flinch. She had already made up her mind. No, Your Honor, she said firmly. The fine should not be dismissed simply because of my position. Dismissing it would only reinforce the very bias I'm addressing. This is an opportunity for us to have a broader conversation about equal treatment under the law. Sarah's tone carried no anger, no resentment, only the unwavering clarity of someone who understood the gravity of this moment. The courtroom fell silent again as Judge Barrett processed her words. It was clear that his earlier posture of unquestioned authority had been utterly dismantled. I propose 3 immediate actions. Your Honor, Sarah continued, each word deliberate, each one carrying the weight of her professional integrity. First, I will pay the $500 fine, not because it's just, but because it will serve as documented evidence of today's proceedings. She paused. Second, I request that you review the last 6 months of contempt charges and fines issued in this courtroom, with a focus on demographic patterns. Another pause. And third, I suggest mandatory bias training for all court personnel, including the bench. The courtroom was quiet, but it was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Everyone present could feel the shift, the impact of Sarah's words settling over the room. The clerk, Mrs. Thompson, was typing faster than ever, making sure every word was captured. The other defendants in the gallery watched, some with surprise, others with pride, as they witnessed Sarah not only standing up for herself, but also for the system of justice she had dedicated her life to serving. It wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It was about confronting the systemic biases that had long been hidden beneath the surface. And Sarah, in that moment, had taken a stand that would ripple far beyond the courthouse walls. Judge Barrett, his face now a shade of crimson, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He seemed to shrink under the weight of Sarah's challenge. The authority he had once wielded with ease was now crumbling, and he could feel it. He cleared his throat again, but it was more a gesture of desperation than command. Attorney Collins, These are very serious allegations you're making." Sarah didn't flinch. She stood tall, her voice steady, unwavering, as she addressed the courtroom with a calm that contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. "Your Honor, it's not just an allegation," she said. "It's a pattern, and patterns of discrimination in our justice system cannot be ignored any longer." The room was charged with energy. Sarah's words had cut through the years of complacency that allowed biases to flourish. Unchecked, Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, had stopped typing altogether, her eyes glued to Sarah. She had seen the injustice for years, and now she was witnessing history in the making. James Wilson, the elderly man who had been watching quietly, felt a surge of pride in his chest. He had witnessed many injustices during his time in the courtroom, but never had he seen someone of Sarah's stature challenge the system so boldly. Judge Barrett's face had turned a deep shade of red, the embarrassment now visible on his face. His usual bluster and authority seemed to have evaporated into thin air. He hesitated before speaking, a sign of his growing discomfort. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't aware of what was happening," he stammered, his voice wavering. But Sarah was not interested in his excuses. "Your Honor," she continued, "what matters now is how we move forward. We cannot undo the past, but we have an opportunity here to change the future. I propose these 3 actions because I believe that justice cannot just be about the law. It must be about how we treat each person who walks through these doors." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Sarah had now taken the mantle of leadership. She was no longer just a defendant, but a voice for the oppressed, a beacon of integrity in a room full of silenced voices. Her proposal was clear. The fine would not be dismissed. Instead, it would serve as a record, a piece of evidence that this system was broken, and that real change needed to happen. Her call for a review of the demographic patterns in fines and charges was a direct challenge to the status quo, and her request for mandatory bias training for all court personnel was an invitation for change from the inside. Judge Barrett's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, his mind racing. The power dynamics had shifted so suddenly and decisively that he no longer seemed in control. His previous commanding demeanor had been stripped away, revealing a man caught in the weight of his own biases. I see," he muttered, though the words sounded less like understanding and more like resignation. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the sounds of Mrs. Thompson's fingers typing furiously, capturing every word. The other defendants, some looking nervous and others with expressions of quiet relief, watched Sarah with admiration. They understood that this moment wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was about challenging the deeply ingrained prejudices in a system meant to serve all people equally. Then, Sarah spoke again, her tone unwavering. "This is about more than just one judge or one incident. This is about systemic change." She turned slightly, addressing the gallery, her gaze sweeping across the room. "The justice system should be blind, but it is not. And today, I'm asking you all to see it, and to stand with me in demanding that it be fixed." Her words, so simple and powerful, rang out like a clarion call, and for the first time that day, Judge Barrett's mouth hung open, his next words lost. His posture had slumped, and his previous authority had evaporated entirely. It was a rare moment in the courtroom, one where a black woman stood not as a victim, but as a champion for justice. Sarah had done more than challenge the judge's authority. She had illuminated the cracks in the very foundation of the system that had long allowed such biases to thrive. The whole room could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the quiet tremor of justice finally starting to demand what it deserved. "I will pay the fine," Sarah said once more, pulling out her checkbook from her briefcase. "But not because it's right. I will pay it because it will serve as evidence for the review that needs to happen. The conversation about bias, about inequality, is just beginning." With those final words, Sarah turned to leave the podium. But the courthouse felt different. Her challenge to the judge's authority had not just changed the trajectory of her own case. It had become a symbol for all those who had suffered in silence. for all those whose voices had been stifled by the prejudice that ran deep in the legal system. As Sarah walked out of the courtroom that day, it wasn't just her steps that resounded, but the beginning of a broader movement for change. The impact of Sarah Collins' actions reverberated far beyond the confines of the municipal courtroom. By the time she stepped out into the morning sunlight, the court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, had already started sending out word of what had transpired. The courthouse was buzzing, the whispers traveling quickly among staff, lawyers, and defendants. For the first time, a conversation had been sparked, a conversation that wasn't just about one judge, but about the systemic biases that plague the very foundation of the justice system. As Sarah left the courtroom, she could feel the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had endured similar treatment. In silence. For years. In the days following, her office phone rang nonstop with calls from other attorneys, many of them black, sharing stories of their own experiences in Judge Barrett's courtroom and in other courtrooms across the district. They had all stayed silent for fear of retaliation. But now, Sarah had given them the courage to speak out. The conversation quickly grew, spilling out from the walls of the courthouse into the public eye. News outlets across Atlanta picked up the story, and within hours, social media was ablaze. Hashtags like #JudgeBarrett and #JusticeForAll began trending as people shared their experiences and frustrations with the systemic bias that had long been tolerated. Sarah's revelation wasn't just a small courtroom moment. It was a catalyst for change. The story spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of Atlanta's legal community and beyond. Civil rights groups reached out to Sarah, asking for her support in documenting other instances of bias and offering resources to amplify the voices of those who had long been silenced. Young law students who had witnessed the exchange in the courtroom, inspired by Sarah's courage, began organizing efforts to bring more attention to racial disparities in the legal system. In a surprising turn, it wasn't just the public who responded. Internal changes began happening within the system itself. By late afternoon, the Judicial Review Board had initiated an investigation into Judge Barrett's conduct. His history of biased rulings was now under the microscope. Sarah had started something that could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, felt a surge of relief as she shared her own records with investigators. She had kept detailed notes over the years of every troubling incident she had witnessed. And now, she finally had the chance to bring them to light. She was not alone in her observations. James Wilson, the elderly man who had watched the entire exchange from the gallery, had seen this pattern too. He had silently witnessed the mistreatment of black defendants for years. But now, his voice, like so many others, was finally being heard. As the investigation into Judge Barrett deepened, more troubling patterns emerged. The data spoke for itself. Black defendants in his courtroom were fined more often, and at higher rates, than white defendants for the same offenses. Racial disparities in sentencing became impossible to ignore. The investigation into Judge Barrett's conduct quickly expanded, revealing a larger issue. This wasn't just about one man's actions, but about a systemic failure in the legal system. The changes came swiftly. Over the next few weeks, the courthouse began to see real shifts in policy. Mandatory bias training was implemented for all court personnel, including judges, clerks, and bailiffs. The court's practices were reviewed regularly, and any signs of racial disparities were immediately flagged for further investigation. The idea of a blind justice system was no longer a slogan. It was becoming a practice. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from a young law student. The student thanked Sarah for showing them that change was possible, for demonstrating that even within a flawed system, someone could stand up and demand justice. This was the impact Sarah's actions had. They inspired a new generation of attorneys, law students, and activists to continue fighting for equality within the system. And for Sarah, this wasn't just a career victory. It was a personal triumph. As she stood in front of her desk, framed by the walls of her office, she looked at the receipt for the $500 fine that had once felt like an affront to her dignity. Now, It stood as a symbol of the change she had helped to ignite, a reminder that one voice, standing firm in the face of injustice, could create ripples that would be felt for generations to come. The next day, as Sarah entered a courtroom for a new case, there was a subtle difference. There was a sense that things were shifting. The stories of those who had come before her, the silent voices, were beginning to be heard. And though the fight was far from over, Sarah knew that she had lit a spark, one that would continue to burn, pushing for change, pushing for justice, and ensuring that equality, though still a long road ahead, was no longer an impossible dream. Thank you so much for watching today's story. We hope it inspired you to reflect on the importance of fairness, understanding, and standing up against injustice. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more heartfelt stories that will touch your soul.